Hello and welcome to my demonstration of my BMI Calculator Project Part 2 MVC Architecture Mobile Application. I'll begin this video with a brief demonstration of each of the required functionalities of my application, and I'll conclude with a discussion about the use of the MVC architecture in my mobile application. My application was developed in Android Studio. So first I'll go ahead and I'll launch Android Studio here. To begin, my project is already loaded in the Android Studio IDE, and as you can see, I already have an emulator running for the demonstration of the app. The emulator I'm running is a Pixel 3 emulator, and I am connected to the VPN. So I'll go ahead and I'll launch my application. As you can see, the application is loaded. It's called BMI Calculator. It's loaded here on the emulator. The user interface is similar to the user interface which was shown in the project instructions, and there are a couple elements here of the UI that are worth mentioning. First is this enter height field, which has a hint preloaded in inches. The second is the enter weight field, a hint preloaded that indicates pounds. Next is this BMI field. So BMI here is going to be loaded after the REST API call. As well, the message here will be loaded after the REST API call. Below we have this call BMI API button. This button is actually going to reach out and call the REST API and fill the BMI and the message fields. And finally we have this educate me button on the bottom. And this educate me button is going to launch a URL also returned in the API call. And that URL is going to be a resource which educates users on BMI. Prior to calling the REST API, this educate me button actually is preloaded to simply launch google.com. So this will demonstrate that the URL changes once a REST API call is made. As you can see, we're still within this BMI calculator application. I'll go ahead and swipe to go back to the original application page, and I'll begin exercising the functionalities. So first I'll enter a height and a weight, and we'll go ahead and make our first REST API call. As you can see, and I'll zoom in to make it easier to see, as you can see the BMI is now filled and the message here is filled as well. And that's from a height and a weight that I entered. And the color of the message here is in blue because this height and weight indicates underweight. Next I'll go ahead and I'll change the weight so we can get a different message. And then I'll go ahead and exercise that REST API call once again. Here you can see that the results have changed. The BMI calculated is displayed here. And now the message is in green, and it indicates that you are a normal BMI given this height and this weight. Once again, I'll go ahead and I will change the height and the weight. And we'll exercise that REST API one more time. As you can see, there's a new BMI loaded. The BMI is over 25, indicating pre-obese, and the color of this message is now in purple. Finally, to exercise the last functionality, I'll go ahead and enter my final weight. I'll call the REST API once again, and as you can see, the message is in red and indicates you are obese. And the BMI has been updated here. It's 32, which is above 30, which is the threshold to receive this message in this color. So now that the REST API has been called, we know that the Educate Me button is no longer going to navigate to Google. It has now been filled with a URL that was returned, one of the 3 URLs which was returned from the REST API call. So to demonstrate, I'll go ahead and click Educate Me one more time. As you can see, we remain in the BMI calculator application, but this time we've navigated to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Healthy Weight, Nutrition, and Physical Activity page. And we can go ahead and scroll and read our resource. I'll go ahead and swipe to go back. So that concludes the demonstration of the functionality of the application. What I've shown is the user interface, entering a height and a weight, and calls to the REST API using the call BMI API button. I've demonstrated each of the different classifications of BMIs. I've demonstrated that this message is updated each time you make a call, and additionally that the message below is updated with a different color indicating the classification. Finally, I demonstrated that the Educate Me button, which initially launched just the Google landing page, is now filled with a URL, which is a resource, the Center for Disease Control page, and that resource URL was returned to my application from the call to the REST API, which I made previously, and that's how we navigate to that page. So with that demonstrated, I'll go ahead and I'll stop the application so we can take a look at the code a little bit closer. First, to go over the implementation of model view controller architecture that was used in my mobile application is the same interpretation that was demonstrated in the lecture videos. To show that, I'll begin with a couple of the lecture slides, as you can see on the screen now. And I'll demonstrate how my code follows the pattern described in these slides. So in this lecture slide, it's an overall overview of the MVC architecture communication pattern. And this communication pattern highlights that there's a view, a controller, and a model, and the flow of actions goes as such. A user action is performed on the view. This is communicated to the controller. The controller then reacts to this user action by asking the model to go ahead and update. So it calls the model's functions directly, indicating that the model should update. When the model is done, when it is completed updating, then it goes ahead and it notifies the controller. This notification in my application is in fact an observer notification. So I'll show how that is done, and that's notified to the controller. The controller, once notified, takes the information, the updated information from the model, and it updates the view using this new information. And then the view is displayed to the user so they can see how that's been updated. So a little bit more on the model and its update and how it notifies the controller in my application. The controller in my application does in fact call the model's functions directly, as I showed in this last slide, so calls models functionalities directly. When the model has updated itself, the way that it notifies the controller in my application is by publishing a message. So the model is observable and the controller is an observer of the model, and so when the model has completed its REST API call, it goes ahead and it publishes a notification which the controller sees, and then that indicates to the controller that it's time to update the view. The controller does in fact make the REST API call, and we'll show here that the model is responsible for network access and remote service calls. So in my application, the model does in fact contact the REST API, and when that REST API returns the result asynchronously, the model notifies observers, in this case the controller, to update the view. So without further ado, I'll switch back to Android Studio and I'll show those elements of my project. So first, and the least interesting to look at is the views. So we have this activity main, this is a view, and as you can see, it contains the UI elements text view, edit text, and then here at the bottom it contains the buttons as well. So this is the view. We'll go ahead and we'll transition to this Java class here. This Java class is the controller. As you can see, it actually implements these on-click methods, and what that is what I showed here in the slides. That's the user action on the view. That's the click. Indicates the controller that it needs to ask the model to update. So that on-click is an indication to the controller that it needs to update the model. As you can see, the controller does in fact have an instance of the model. And that model instance has its methods called directly, and those methods are called to actually invoke the API call. We'll transition to the model here. And in the model which is responsible for network access and service contacting, it would also be responsible if this was a database. This model goes ahead and it makes that REST API call. And when it makes the REST API call, it then updates its fields, and that's message and BMI. Those are the things which are displayed to the user, and the URL as well. And this is the URL which Educate Me uses to launch that CDC page. As you can see here, it has all of the elements needed to invoke a REST API call. So you have, this is the REST API URL and the connection, and then it checks the status of the return message, and it goes ahead, it creates a JSON object out of the response, and it sets the BMI, as well as the message and the JSON array which contains the URL. Finally, we can see that when these values are actually set in the model, set message in this case, or set BMI, it goes ahead and it notifies observers, and that is what I showed in this slide where the model notifies the controller. And here you can see the controller goes ahead and it performs that update when it's been notified. So when the notification is published, you can see here that the observer, the controller, is added as an observer to the model. And when that notification is published, it goes ahead and it does that update, and the update updates the view. It sets text on the view based on these new fields, and it changes the color as well. And that demonstration and discussion of the MVC architecture concludes my video of my BMI calculator project part 2. Thank you for watching.